everyone, Jai Hind, and once again welcome to the platform of Shri Ram IAS. आप सभी का स्वागत है and we were discussing the various polity concepts and yesterday we spoke about the company's rule. In today's session, we'll be discussing about the crown rule. My name is Bhavar Singh Soy. I'm ex-India 115th course, and today we'll be discussing all the different, evolution of the constitutional framework during the crown rule that we'll be studying in today's session. And most importantly, we'll be focusing upon the Indian Council Act as well as the Government of India Act 1935. So these are the acts that we will be studying today. Now, when we talk about the evolution of the constitutional framework, the most important thing is that after the revolt of 1857, the first war of independence, so what happened was that the complete control of the political establishment in India, it went to the crown. Now, when we speak about the history, in the historical perspective, it is important to go through the Government of India Act of 1858. However, when we talk about the political setup or the evolution of the constitution, so over here we have the four important acts which played a very prominent role. And these four important acts that we'll be studying in today's session, they are very, very important for understanding the evolution of the constitutional framework. But at the back of it, what was happening? All right, so what was the need, why these reforms became inevitable and why these reforms were made by the Britishers. Now, the first and the foremost thing is that there was a political awakening at this point of time. The Indians, they were getting educated, and the educated Indians, they created a pressure for the participation in the governance as well as in the decision-making process, and that was a compelling force behind the devolution of the powers that you will be seeing over here. All right, so till now there was a centralization that was focused and that was that was built up by the Britishers and the East India Company by this point of time. But now over here you will see that now the force of decentralization will move on. All right, at the same time there was rise of Congress, right? After the establishment of Indian National Congress in 1885, that provided for an organized platform for articulating the demands for the self-governance. All right, at the same time, there was self-governance demand that was raised, and for the meaningful participation in the legislative processes, the Indians, they started demanding their presence in the legislative or law-making processes. All right, and at the same time, there was a British strategy. And this strategy recognized that it is necessary for accommodating the limited Indian participation so that the rising unrest in the minds of the Indians that could be dealt off. So these are the different conditions that led to the formation or formulation of various acts during the Crown Rule. Now, the first act that we'll be studying is the Indian Council Act of 1861, and this was the first step where the Indians were accommodated into the legislative process for the first time, and that was the first and the foremost primary objective of Indian Council Act 1861. The legislative councils, they were revived after 1858, and the Governor General's Council was enlarged. When I'm talking about Governor General's Council, 6 to 12 members were added, additional members were added to the Governor General's Council, and the power to make the laws for the entire British India was given to this Governor General's Council. All right, and over here, it was it was a marking of the decentralization, where the process of decentralization or the beginning of decentralization started, and Bengal, Bombay and Madras, they were decentralized. Or we can say that up to now what happened was that the Bombay and Madras, they were subordinate to the Bengal presidency, but now they were decentralized and they were given their own powers to make laws. All right, so this act was a very significant step or a very historical step towards granting Indians the association into the legislative making powers. Alright, the next act is Indian Council Act of 1892. Now, these Indian Council, the Indian Council was basically a member body that was there in Britain, and that was that was formulating these laws, or these laws were formulated by that member body. Alright, so over here again, what happened was, in this law or in this act, there was participation that was enhanced or expanded. The Legislative Council, they were expanded to include more Indians into as a member, and therefore, when we are talking about 1892 Indian Council Act, the participation of the Indians were enlarged in the councils that were there. Now over here, very important and prominent thing that happened is that the members, they were granted the powers to discuss the budget. But however, it is very important to note that they were granted this power to discuss the budget, but there were no voting rights that were granted on the financial matters, as well as no supplementary questions could be asked. All right, कोई भी supplementary question भी नहीं पूछा जा सकता था, and it was the first time that there was the introduction of the indirect election. The electoral principle was taken care of unofficially, and it was a shift towards the representative governance. All right, when we are talking about the questions, the members could ask specific questions, but however, when I'm talking about the supplementary questions, they were not given this right. Now, later on, we had very prominent act that came, that is Indian Council Act of 1909. Or it is also prominently known as Morley-Minto reforms, because at that point of time, the Secretary of State was Morley and the Viceroy was Minto. So on their name, it is also known or remembered as Morley-Minto reforms. So in 1905, there was participation of Bengal, and there was extremism that was rising in the minds of Indians, as well as there was rise of the nationalist sentiments, and that created a pressure for the reforms. At the same time, there was, in 1909, there was a major change that was introduced over here that led to, or it was basically the British's agenda to break down this nationalist sentiment that was there in the minds of the Indians. All right, and this is one of the most prominent things that later on led to the partition of India, and this act laid down the communal politics that shaped the India to come into the future. Alright, now when we are talking about the key features of this act, what are the key features of this act? It increased the Indian representation, but at the same time, what happened was there was separate electorate that was granted to Muslims. Alright, separate electorate. Right now, we also have the reservation in India. But however, how this separate electorates was different from the reservation that we have. Alright, we have reservation. We have the reserved seats for the scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and as well as other backward classes. And for the women as well. We have the 106th Amendment Act also that was passed for granting the 1/3 reservation for the women in India. Alright, now, how this reservation is different from the separate electorate, because over here in separate electorate, the candidate would be Muslim, and only the Muslim people who are eligible to vote, they would be casting their votes in the favor of the candidates that would be there. But however, when we talk about the reservation system in Indian politics that is there, over here the seats are reserved, but the electorates are not reserved. That means everybody has the right to cast their vote irrespective of their religion, and that is why these two are different. Alright, so there was a communal representation, and separate electorate was introduced for Muslim, and that is the backbone of what led to the partition later on in India. Alright, so there was communal representation that was introduced in India, and the members, they could discuss now budget as well. Alright, they could discuss budget, and also they were given the powers to ask the supplementary questions that was not granted before. Also, over here, Satyendra Prasad Sinha, he became the first Indian to be associated with the Executive Council of Governor General, and also it also widened the political participation while maintaining the British control all over the subjects. Now, the next important act that we will be discussing is Indian Council Act of 1919. It's called as Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, again because Montagu at that point of time was the Secretary of State and Chelmsford was the Viceroy. Alright, after the World War I and as well as the Montagu Declaration of 1917, that promised that there would be extended or gradual development of self-governance in India, this particular act was introduced. Over here, there was a very prominent feature that was introduced, and that is diarchy in provinces. Now, when we talk about diarchy, what is known by diarchy? Alright, diarchy is where the subjects, we have the subjects of the legislation or the subjects onto which the laws could be made, those subjects were basically divided into two different groups. Now, the first group was the reserved subjects. These reserved subjects, like for example, law and order, finance, they were controlled by governor and his executive council, which had the Britishers as members, all right? And they were transferred subjects. These subjects, they were transferred to the legislative council of the governor. They were somewhat a kind of subjects which were not so much important, like for example, education, health and agriculture, which were devolved or they were given to the Indians, where in the legislative council, the Indians now had majority. All right, there was a bicameral legislature that was introduced in the central legislature, where it was divided into council of states, that is upper house that we know right now as Rajya Sabha, and the legislative assembly or the lower house that we call it as the Lok Sabha right now. All right, so there was bicameral legislature that was introduced. The direct elections were introduced for the first time in 1919 by the Act of the 1919, and it expanded the democratic participation significantly. However, the electorate or the right to cast vote, all right, that was not given to everyone. There were certain conditions that had to be met, and very limited people or the people of India, they were able to cast their vote at this point of time. There was increased recruitment of the Indians to the civil services and also administrative positions, and that had led to the Indianization of various services. Now, when we talk about the Act of 1919, all right, the Act of 1919 or Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, so there were certain progresses as well as limitations of this Act. When we are talking about the achievements, there was provincial autonomy, all right, the diarchy that was introduced. It introduced the idea of responsible government at the provincial level. That means it laid the groundwork at the grassroots levels. All right, there was electoral democracy where direct elections began, as well as when we are talking about the council, the legislative council grew exponentially, leading to the membership of the Indians that gained majority in the legislative council. However, there were certain limitations of 1919 Act. The diarchy was a failure. All right, the dual system, it proved unworkable in practice. Although this looks like very good in theory, but it proved worthwhile, and also it was futile, and therefore it was unworkable, and the governors, they actually retained most of the powers to themselves and also the authority. All right, the central control remained intact. Still, the real power remained firmly with the British authorities that were there, and also the communal representation, the separate electorates, it was expanded further. All right, further, which deepened the communal division in Indian politics at this point of time. Now, the most prominent and most important act of the Britishers that was made was the Government of India Act of 1935. This was a constitutional milestone because when we are talking about it, there was Simon Commission that came in 1927, there was Nehru Report, and also the 3 round table conferences. All these led to the culmination of the Government of India Act 1938 at this point of time. And this laid down the structure, federal structure. All right, it proposed that there would be a union of British India as well as the princely states, and the complete federal structure would be there. However, it never got implemented. All right, at the same time, there was provincial autonomy that was given. The provinces were given the autonomy, but at the same time, when we are talking about the diarchy was introduced at the center level. All right, so diarchy was introduced at the center, whereas when we are talking about the provincial autonomy, the autonomy was granted to the provinces. At the same time, some provinces, they had the bicameral legislature, and at the same time, there was a federal court that we now know as Supreme Court of India that was established in 1937 following the Government of India Act of 1935. Now, these are the key highlights when we talk about there was provincial autonomy that was given, federal scheme or the federal structure was proposed. At the same time, there was franchisee extension. There was approximately 10% of the population or 30 million people who gained the voting rights. And also, when we are talking about the institutional foundation, we have the Public Service Commission, UPSC, as well as we have the Supreme Court that were established after the Government of India Act of 1935. And please note that 85% of our constitution is basically, it is on this particular act, that is Government of India Act of 1935. Or you can say that it served as the blueprint for the Indian Constitution. Alright, so over here you can see that when we talk about UPSC generally focuses in the Crown's rule, it focuses on these three important acts. Alright, these three important acts that we are talking about, 1909 Act, then we have 1919 Act and the Government of India Act of 1935. And you can see over here when we are talking about representation, in 1909, communal representation was granted to Muslims. Then in 1919 Act, it was broadened significantly. And when we are talking about 1935 Act, over here, the franchisee was widened and multiple groups were added to the communal representation, or the when we are talking about the separate electorates. All right. The type of government in 1909 was autocratic, but later on, there was diarchy that was introduced in provinces in 1919 and 1935. There was provincial autonomy that was provided, and the diarchy was included, or it was established in the center or at the center. The election method in 1909 was indirect, but then it became direct election when we are talking about 1919 Act, and in 1935 the franchisee was widened. And then when we talk about federalism, in 1909 there was none, and there were none of the provision of the federalism in 1990 Act, but in 1935 Act there was the provision of the federalism that was granted. Again, when we are talking about communal division was done in 1909 Act, there was responsible government experiment at the provinces by including or introducing the diarchy that was done by 1990 Act, but at the same time, when we are talking about 1935 Act, it is a very prominent act that has acted as a constitutional blueprint for the Constitution of India. Alright, so when we are talking about the three acts, they have three different patterns. The 1909 Act was based on divide and rule policy, where the communal representation and separate electorates were introduced. When we are talking about 1919, there was a theme of responsibility but without power, where diarchy was introduced in the provinces but only in theory, not in practice. And at the same time, when we talk about 1935 Act, the power was given but without any freedom, any real freedom. Alright, so over here, these are this is how that we have seen the constitutional evolvement or evolution during this period of time, that is during the Crown's rule. Now, after listening to this complete video, you can answer these questions effectively and on your own. The first question is, which act introduced diarchy at the provincial level? Alright, dividing subjects into reserved and transferred list. So, you have to give the answer by commenting your answers down below in the comments. Alright, so please be prepared for answering these questions. Question number 1. Then question number 2, which act proposed All India Federation consisting of British India and princely state, though it was never fully implemented? And question number 3, what was the main legacy of Indian Council Act of 1909 and why is it considered controversial act? So these three questions you have to give your answers. Please write down your answers in the comment and let me know that you have equally enjoyed this video, and we'll be discussing furthermore different concepts of polities in very short duration. Alright, now when we are talking about over here, the next session that we'll be focusing is the making of the Constitution. That is, we'll be focusing between 1946 to 1950, how our Constitution was made, about the Constituent Assembly in the next session. So till then, take care of yourself. Bye-bye, take care, thank you. And also do not forget to like, share and subscribe to our channel. Thank you, bye-bye, take care and Jai Hind.